Okay. Okay, so first I'm just going to check in with Carly. Carly, can you still hear me? Okay, cool. All right. So, software development process, just some fundamentals. So I've taken like whole uni courses on this topic, so we're not going to cover it in complete detail, but we're going to cover some basics so that you have an understanding of the overall software development process, which is important any kind of developer that you are. Okay, if you're doing software development, you have to have an idea of what is involved in the software development process so that you understand the context that you're working in. I think it's really important. So we'll look at what the software development process is, who makes up a software development team. It's not just the developers. How do we follow the process? And I'll just kind of generally talk about two different ways that this process is executed, one called waterfall and one called agile. And then I'll talk about some of the tools that we use to manage this process. So developing software for commercial use involves a lot of steps and a lot of people. So you have to have a well-defined process or it's anarchy. It doesn't work. And the software doesn't get created on time and delivered to customers. And then when it does get delivered to customers, it doesn't work right. And it's not a lot of fun when that happens. So it's really important to have a well-defined process. So at a really high level, we get requirements from our client and our stakeholders. So stakeholders could include the people that are going to pay for our software, the stockholders in our company, the managers, the project managers, the people in control of resources in the company. So all of these different stakeholders will contribute to the requirements, because the customer can want what they want, but we're going to have a fixed amount of money and people to get the job done. So the people who know about how much money there is and how that money should be used are also stakeholders that contribute to the requirements formation. Okay? So we get requirements. Then we develop an overall architecture or design for the solution, taking into account the requirements. Once we've decided on that architecture and design, we write code, and we review the code, we test the code, and then we release it. So this is a very high-level overview process. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail with who's involved. So requirements are determined by the stakeholders, which include people like the client and the product manager. So it could include other people, but these are two typical audiences that are included in the requirements discussion. There will also be technical people involved, because clients and product managers generally don't have a good sense of the technical aspects of the project. So they can say, we want this magical unicorn, and then the developers will be like, you're dreaming, man, because that ain't possible with that amount of money and that much time. So you generally have technical stakeholders involved as well, and those would be typically the senior developers on the team who are there to make sure that the people who come up with the requirements are living on this planet and are saying things that make sense. Yeah, so when that doesn't happen, then it's usually pretty bad. So I've been on teams where we had salespeople go out and talk to customers and promise them all kinds of ridiculous things that were not in any way possible. And then they come back to the development team and say, hey, we said you were going to make this in 3 months. And then we're like, you're crazy, man. That's not possible. We can't do that. And they're like, well, you have to, because we told the customer you will. And we're like, well, sorry. You're going to lose your commission because we can't do it. So, and then we try to find a compromise, but that's not really the best way to do things. So anyway, we get some requirements. Hopefully they're good requirements. And you can see that if we start off with bad requirements, then we're already kind of doomed from the beginning. But assuming we get some good requirements, then some technical people, developers, designers, architects, will create an architecture or design for the solution based on the requirements. And then we have, developers typically writing the code and reviewing each other's code and testing the code. So you may also have a quality assurance team, a QA team, involved as well. In big projects, you almost always do. So there's QA engineers, quality assurance engineers, which are also technical people who have an understanding of code, but their emphasis, their specialty is in writing tests and automated tests and integrated tests and system tests and performance tests, stress tests, all of those things in order to make sure that the code that's going to be released actually does what it's supposed to do and does so in all sorts of conditions and environments. So on a really small team, like a startup company where you only have like 2 or 3 developers or sort of less than 5, then generally the developers are doing all of this. They are designing, they're architecting, they're writing the code, reviewing the code, and they are responsible for quality assurance as well. And so you'll see everything in between. I've worked on teams with hundreds of people on them working on a project across geographies, and for those teams we had quite large QA teams, and there was quite a division of tasks between people. And I've worked on small teams with like 5 people, or even I worked on a team once where we had 3 people, and we did everything. So those, I always worked for big companies, so those small projects were like sort of proof of concept projects where we had, as an IBM acquired some new technology by acquiring a company, and we would do some work to see if we could make that technology work with a solution we already had. IBM wouldn't want to invest a lot of resources on that, but they would invest just enough so that we could do a proof of concept to see, yeah, we can make this work, or no, actually this is going to be too hard, we can't make this work. So you might see anything, okay, out there. It depends on what size project you work on. The way the teams look could be different. But roughly speaking, at a high level, you're always going to have these steps involved in the process, okay? And then finally, when everything's tested, you feel like, okay, we can let customers and clients use this thing, then you release it. And that release process, again, depending on the size of the team, there could be a deployment team, an operations team. DevOps is what you'll hear it referred to, developer operations. So those operations teams may be responsible for establishing and maintaining that infrastructure on which your application is deployed, and they may take care of deploying those releases to that architecture, that physical architecture, or if you're a really small team, it could be done by the developers. So what you'll find is that out in the world, if you work as a developer for like a startup, for a small or a really small business, you will have to have some DevOps knowledge. Okay? If you have some development skills, particularly if you grow your scripting skills, because a lot of DevOps is about scripting, and also about understanding how pieces of things fit together and writing scripts to connect those pieces together. That's a lot of what DevOps is. In my career as a developer, I learned DevOps along the way out of necessity. So even though I always worked on large teams, even if we have a dedicated operations team, they don't have the depth of technical understanding of the thing they're releasing that the developers do. So we as developers know how this thing runs and what the resource requirements are and how it's going to be used by the client. And a DevOps team may not have the whole picture, and so they depend on developers to help them make good choices about deployment, and also depend on developers to help them write scripts and tests to make sure that everything that's deployed is running properly. So on the last team I worked on at SAP, we helped the DevOps team write a health check application. So it was another application. So we had our main application that we worked on as developers, and just as sort of a part of our everyday job, we helped the DevOps team develop another application that was just a health check application for the application that we released. And it had some very different characteristics from the application we actually worked on. So the application we worked on was on the .NET platform. It was in C# with some HTML and CSS and JavaScript. The health check application was mostly written in scripting languages, and there were some HTML and CSS components to it, but it was a completely different project, that health check application, and its job was to make sure that the application was running and that all the pieces of infrastructure that our application used, like job servers and load balancers and application servers, there were all these bits and pieces that our application needed to run on, and we helped to write the health check application that made sure all those pieces were running the way we expected them to run. And that, wasn't in the job description when I took the job. It just turned out to be something we had to do. And I learned a lot in the process of taking on that role that I didn't know about DevOps before I took that role. And that was okay. So, and I had, was given some time to learn what I had to learn, and got to work with some people who had some experience in that, and I learned a bunch of stuff. So, release is a really important part, though. You have to be able to release your product to deploy it somewhere that other people can use it. So when you're developing your software, it's generally on your laptop, right? And then you check it into source control, and other people can pull it down from source control, and they can run it. The QA team has a method to pull it down from source control, and they can test it. But you have to deploy it somewhere that customers can use it. And that has to be done with, the licensing considered and all of these other things, access to the product. So that's a huge piece of software development. If you can't make money on it, there's not much point in building it, is there? And if you, can't reliably deploy it for your customers to get access to it, then you're going to have problems with your money flow. And if you don't have built into your process, what do you do when there are bugs in what you release? Because I promise you, there will be bugs in what you release. No matter how well you do the other parts of this process, code review and test, there will still be bugs in what you release. Always and forever, there will be bugs in what you release. So, and I promise you that your customers will find them. And then they'll raise tickets. And then they'll get really upset if you don't fix the problem, even if you think, look, that's not really a big problem. Like, there's a workaround. Just do it this way. And they're like, well, I paid a lot of money for this software, and I don't think I should have to use the workaround. The workaround doesn't work for me. I want it to just work the way it's supposed to work. Yeah, Josh.
That's fair enough if they have to pay like a $50 program.
Absolutely.
Or like even a $20 or $15 program. If you pay for a program and it has bugs,
yeah,
and all that you should expect for it to be fixed.
You should, absolutely.
You spend money on it. If it was like a free program,
if it's open source, yeah.
If it's free, it's just like a new social media application.
Oh, no, I was
and it
talking
doesn't work.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, well, I don't like this, I'm not going to use it. You're a free user that you were potentially making some money off.
Yes.
It's not your user anymore.
Yeah. No, I was talking about like if the main fundamentals of the program don't work or something like that. With a free program, or if there's small little hiccups in it.
And look, they're all different.
Because they didn't have enough resources to.
Yeah, look, they're all different kinds of cases. In the case of open source software, generally what happens is because you have a whole community contributing to that software. And you'll hear people say this, and I believe it's true, that open source software is more robust and more likely to get fixed because you have communities backing up that development who are personally invested, just out of their own passion for this software running well because they want people to use it, okay? In a proprietary situation, so the last team I worked on, we had, we had about 15,000 customers for this particular product I worked on. And with those 15,000 customers, there were probably 5 million users, in those companies using the product. And it was not cheap. It was really expensive. The licenses for this software were like, $10,000 per user or something like that. Like really expensive. And we had 6,000 open customer incidents when I left the team. Okay? And about 30% of those were P2 or P1 incidents. Yeah, so we had P1 is priority 1 incident, we're supposed to fix those within 24 hours. A P2 is, and the designation for a P1 is that it significantly prohibits them from conducting their business because the software they're using has this problem. So it's costing them money because this problem exists, and there's no workaround to the problem. So that's a P1. A P2 is it significantly is impacting their business, but there is a workaround, but the workaround's difficult to employ and costs them some money to employ. Maybe because it costs them extra people to do the workaround. And then a P3 is it's just an inconvenience. They don't like it. It's not the way it's supposed to work. A P4 is really, okay, this is, it'd be nice if it worked this way instead of this way. So, when you have 6,000 open bug reports, you pretty much ignore the P3s and P4s. You only have time to focus on the P1s and P2s. And so the reality is that we had really large customers paying lots of money, and they didn't really have a choice but to deal with the problem because they had invested so much time and money into the solution already. Their choices are stick with it, keep complaining and getting upset with us, and try to get these things to resolution, or change their whole solution to use somebody else's without knowing if it's going to actually be any better, and with a significant cost to make that change, right? So they get sort of put over a barrel and don't really have a choice but to live with the problems. Yeah.
In those type of teams, like fixing the bugs and all that, wouldn't it be a good idea to have certain sections, like P1 sections, people who focus on P1s, people who focus on P2s, people who focus on...
So we would try different, because here's the reality, is that the developers that are going to work on those problems are also the developers who have to work on the new features, right? And we constantly have this pipeline of, we have salespeople out promising customers these new features. They're going to be delivered on this timeline. And then we have all of these problems being reported by customers. And then we have all of this technical debt, what we call technical debt, which are things we know as developers we didn't do well. They're going to come bite us on the ass one day. But we didn't have time to deal with it properly in this release. So we put that in the technical debt bucket of things that we really should do. Adding automated tests is always in that bucket, And the reality is you work with a team with a fixed number of developers. And so then as a team leader, as an engineering manager, you have to work out, who do I put on P1, P2 issues? How do I divvy up their time so that we still get the features done on time and we address customer issues that we need to address? And it is not an easy problem to solve. Did you have a,
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's also a business admin kind of thing, or a business direction kind of thing, where you could go, these problems are tough, how do we focus on the customers that are mostly happy with our product and just do a few changes and develop a customer base by having that focus group and having just a bunch of people that love your product and they ask for something and it happens and everything really works.
Absolutely, and we would do that. The last place I worked, we had a list of what we called white glove customers that were the ones that were, mostly happy with what we did and also gave us lots and lots of money. And we would focus on, their problems would get special attention, and as well as the features they wanted would get special attention.
Yeah, so it's a big company that has 1,000 employees that are paying per user or something like that.
Yes.
You want them to be completely happy with everything that they're using it for?
Yes, exactly. So, look, my advice is whenever possible, don't get into a team that is a total mess. Because what happens is you start to feel, you take it personally, like you as a developer aren't doing a good job when it's not actually, it's a systemic problem. It's a problem that exists in the system, not with a particular developer. And unfortunately, I think a lot of teams, especially in large companies, when a company gets really big, this sort of mess that I'm talking about is like the norm. It's just the way things are. And so you learn, if you work in that environment, which I did for 20 years, then you learn how to just manage yourself in the work in that environment. and you do, make small differences along the way, and you have to feel good about those small differences that you make. But I would tell you that when you're going to apply for jobs, and likely you'll start, like certainly your internships will be with smaller companies, because we feel like the experience you get out of that is more valuable. You'll have to do more work working for a small company. Large companies take 3 months to onboard somebody sometimes, so you're not going to get much out of a 4-week internship. So, if you're applying for smaller companies, and there are heaps of small companies in Brisbane, okay, that are hiring developers, ask questions in the interview about their development process and their automated testing suite and their feedback culture. So how well do they manage doing retrospectives? We'll talk about that in a bit. Making sure that the processes they're following are good processes, that we don't end up in a case where code isn't tested or isn't reviewed, that the release process isn't well managed. Ask them about their process and how it's managed and who's involved, and try to get a sense that, okay, this is a place with some order and some thoughtfulness that I'm going to be happy working, and feel like I know what I'm supposed to do and I'm supported to do the job that I'm supposed to do. All right, so as far as ways we can follow this process, there are a lot of different ways. And even within these two kind of broad categories, there's a lot of different ways. But we're just going to talk about these approaches mostly at a high level, anyway, at first. So in the waterfall method, this is the traditional way of developing software. And it's characterized by being really well-defined, with well-defined cycles, but it's really rigid. So there's not a lot of room for changes, and that actually doesn't work well with software development because there are always changes. Agile is the new way. Well, it's not really new. It was developed in 2001, and probably some of you may have been born after that. So 2001 isn't really that new, but relatively new. And the Agile method is an iterative process. So it's characterized by flexibility and continuous incorporation of feedback from the client and from all the stakeholders and the people involved. So in this course, we're going to teach and use the Agile methodology because it's by far the more popular way to develop these days, and certainly with small teams, it's the way that's used. And you're more likely to find yourself on a small team at the start. So that's what we're going to talk about. And it definitely has some advantages over waterfall. I mean, waterfall only works in a very limited number of cases. So with waterfall, all the requirements, designs, schedules, and the expected end products are agreed upon firmly between the development team and the client before any development begins. So you decide down to, some pretty good detail, this is what we're delivering and when we're going to deliver it by. And the pros for that, of course, is that as a developer, you know exactly what you're going to have to produce, more or less, before you even start. So you know what the target is. You know what you are signing up for before you even start. And you start with completed designs with well-defined expected results. Okay? And that's kind of nice as a developer to have that sort of idea of what you're going to work on. As a project manager, you have a clear idea of when the completed product will release because everything is well and completely documented. So you spend a lot of time on documentation in Waterfall and documenting everything up front with as much detail as possible. So the cons are that it takes longer to get something out because there's so much documentation required. Okay? When problems happen, and they will, there's little or no room to recover, which often leads to delivering late. So waterfall projects, even though we say this is when we're going to deliver it, rarely get delivered on time because stuff comes up, things have to change, and the cycles are so rigid and the requirements are so rigid, the schedule's so rigid that there's no room for problems to happen or things to change. And that inevitably ends up in delays or a reduction in function, which costs the company money. So you agree with the client, this is what we're going to provide by this date, and then you can't meet that. So either you say, okay, we're going to deliver less, we'll deliver the rest of this later, and then the client doesn't have to pay you what they said they were going to pay you up front. Or, you say, okay, we can deliver it with all that functionality, but 3 months later, and then of course, there's cost associated with that you lose. So and another big con, this is the biggest con, is with this methodology, you rarely, if ever, deliver what the client actually wants. Even though it's what they thought they wanted. Even though it's what you agreed on and said, this is what we're going to give you, you deliver it, and they're like, this isn't actually what we need. And then it's too bad, because you've already gone and spent all that money and time and delivered this thing, right? So that's the biggest con for waterfall management. In Agile management, it's an iterative approach. So what that means is we break the work down into small pieces that can be done in a small period of time, generally in less than 2 weeks. Sometimes, depending on the project, the scope of the project, it could be things we can deliver within 2 days or within 1 day. We break the work down into small pieces like that, and then we do all of the parts of the process that we looked at: design, develop, review, test, release, on each of those small pieces. Okay? And the benefit of that is that we have something to show to the client after each iteration. So every couple of days or every week or 2 weeks, whatever you decide is the appropriate length of time for a sprint. At the end of that sprint, you have something to show to the client, and you can get their feedback. So you always have a working product. It might not be fully functional, but you always have something that's working that you can show the client and say, okay, we added this page where we display your list of products. Does this look the way you expect it to? Is there anything you'd like to change about the way that this looks? And you can get feedback from the client, and you can incorporate that into future iterations of the work. And so because you're getting feedback all along the way, you're much more likely to develop something the client actually wants. Yeah. So you give them what they want. Yeah, Jai? Isaac? Did you? Okay.
No,
okay.
Firstly, the number of people who work on that small chunk, the number of people are less,
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
that induces lesser bugs because there is less misunderstanding between
That's
the number
right.
of people who are involved.
That's right. So we tend to work in smaller groups in this kind of paradigm. As soon as we understand the basic requirements, we can start working on stuff. We don't have to go through defining the entire project from start to finish with detailed designs before we start writing code. We, once we understand the requirements, we agree on the requirements. Then we design just this piece. We agree that this is what we want. We don't throw a lot of documentation at it, just enough that we can get agreement that everybody's on the same page. And then we can start coding that piece and show it to the client and get feedback from the client. So another pro is that less formal documentation makes happy coders. Most developers don't like to write documentation. Some of them do. I love documentation. I love writing documentation. Documentation makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside when things are well documented. But mostly developers hate documentation. So they tend to like this method more. The cons are, for the developer and the client, it can feel chaotic if it's not well managed. So it's really important that you have an experienced Scrum Master. So a Scrum Master is one role in Agile methodology. The Scrum Master's role is to be responsible for the deliverables being delivered on time for a particular sprint. And so the Scrum Master is responsible for making sure that everybody's on task and doing what we agreed is going to be done in this sprint and not doing something else. It means that it has to be clear to a developer, what is it that I'm supposed to be working on today? And that means that you have to have tools and processes in place that make it really easy for a developer to know, what am I supposed to be working on? And for the rest of the team to know that's what he's working on. Okay? So we have to have things in place like stand-up meetings. A stand-up meeting is a meeting that takes place every day. In some teams, it may take place more than once a day when the schedule's really short. Like if it's a 2-day sprint schedule, you might meet twice a day. You might have a stand-up twice a day. And in a stand-up meeting, everyone who's working on that team, and it's usually less than 10 people, okay? And those are people who are testing, who are product managers, who are developers. They get together, and sometimes the client too, get together every day and say, this is what I'm working on, this is where I'm stuck, this is what I'm going to work on. This is what I worked on yesterday, this is what I'm working on today, and this is where I'm stuck, if I'm stuck anywhere. Every person shares that really quickly so that the whole team always knows who's working on what. And you can see that if you didn't do that, it would be really easy for stuff to slip. A lot of coders go down the rabbit hole really easily. We get distracted. We start working on one thing, and then we're not quite sure how to do this thing, so we go look stuff up on Google, and then we find this YouTube about this other really cool thing, and we're like, oh, that is so cool. I should redo this other thing that we did the other day using that because it would be so much cooler, and I know everybody would agree, so I'm just going to go work on that. And then you work on that other thing that isn't even on the list of things to do. So you have to have something in place that keeps everybody really disciplined and really on task so that things get done on time, right? And if that isn't in place, if you don't have leaders in place to kind of make sure that that's happening, then it turns into chaos really easily, and things don't get done. So another con is that it kind of gives the client license to change their mind more. If you're going back to them after each sprint and saying, are you happy with this? Then they might, look at it and be like, oh, you know what? It'd be really cool if, and then you have to have somebody who's good at negotiating or dealing with that situation and saying, okay, so you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is you want these additional things, but we've already planned work for the next sprint, and these are the things that we're going to do. If you want to do these additional things, we either need to push the schedule out, or we need to take some of these other things off the list. What do you want to do? You tell me what you want, right? And if you don't have somebody who's good in that role, at first of all clarifying what's being asked for and what the schedule is, and understanding that, making it clear to the client, and then being firm with the client about, we can't do everything, okay? We can do this or we can do this. What's more important to you? And we're happy to do whatever you say is more important to you. But if you don't have somebody in that role who does that job well, then you get scope creep, and then things just get completely blown out, right? And that can turn into a big problem when you have agile methodology. Yeah, Jai.
So if a customer wanted to change something later on down in the application or whatever they want as part of development, if they really wanted that change, would you charge them extra for it? Would you charge?
It depends. So you have to have that. You have to, first of all, have a process in place for when that happens. You have to have done the work of fairly good estimation of the tasks that are already on the table. Okay? So you can say, and you can show the client, these are the things that you've already said you wanted, and we've estimated these things, and this is how long it's going to take us, and this is when you said you wanted it by. These new things that you're asking us to do, and you might, have a 30-minute meeting with your senior developers to say, how long would it take us to do this? Let's estimate the scope of this. Then you say to the client, these new things you're asking us to do are going to take 5 days. Do you want us to take those 5 days in this sprint and take 5 days of work out, or do you want to postpone? And then as far as how you're getting paid for it, you have to decide that has to be something that's going to be project dependent. So you'll have to have had some agreement with the client ahead of time. Either you're getting paid by the hour, like a consultant, right? And you say, okay, this is going to add 5 days of work, so you're going to pay for those 5 days, or do you want to take something else out? Or did you agree to a pay, for the project as a whole, and then you need to be able to negotiate. What does that mean if they ask for more stuff? Do you say no, or do you say you got to give us more money if you want that? Yeah. So these are all, you can see that it's not just development that's involved here, and you can see that it's really important to have tools in place that make it really transparent what it is that we've agreed to do, what are we working on, and how long is it going to take us, and when do we think it's going to be done, and that everybody knows how to use those tools and uses those tools. Did you have something, Chris?
Yeah, just because I've done a bit of graphic design and whatnot, and through my experience with that, a lot of customers don't really see the value in what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore it's hard to ask for more money when people are saying, no, we need to change this, we need to change this, we need to change this. Because it's such, this industry is such, it has a technical background and it is seen as difficult. Do you still have those problems, or are those problems seen as often?
I don't know if I can answer that conclusively in any way, but I think that without really good communication and well-defined and transparent and agreed upon items that are going to be done, and the estimation of those items, how many man hours it's going to take to do those items. I think if that stuff is missing, then it turns into a problem. I think as long as that stuff is there, then it's manageable. So I think that clients recognize that it is a highly skilled thing that they're paying for, but they might, if you don't show them, if you don't make it clear to them, this is what it takes in order to provide this, then there's going to be confusion about it and misunderstanding and assumptions made about it.
I suppose in this industry you have the security in the sense of changing, or before you release the code to your client, they don't really have much control over the code, so the difference there being in a graphic design, would put a spot over it, just like a signature type thing in this industry.
Yeah, like a watermark or something.
Watermark.
Yeah.
But in this industry,
You do have a bit more security, because you do have the control unless you give it to the client.
Yeah.
So, and generally the client doesn't want the code. They want you to keep the code and maintain the code. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Isaac.
Just with the ability for the clients to change their mind, does on the debate of procedural versus object oriented, is object oriented lend itself more to agile development?
I don't know. I don't know that I don't know that that's necessarily true. I can see why you asked that question. But I think in general your code needs to be well written. Even if it's procedural, it needs to be modular, it needs to be testable, it needs to be reusable. Object-oriented lends itself to that sort of naturally. It was made for that. So yeah, I think in that sense it might be true. Yeah, but even if you write procedural code, you need to make sure that it's dry and reusable and modular. Yeah. Yes, Jai.
Yeah, with my father used to own a construction company.
Mm.
So what they did, there were a certain amount of weeks before they started, the customer could come and say, oh no, we've thought about this, we want to do this instead.
Yeah.
But after that time limit, say after like 4 weeks, they charge.
Yeah.
After that to change it because they've already started.
Yes.
So it will cost them a lot more money to do it.
Yeah.
So I think that would also be a good way to sort of kind of
It could be.
speed
I've
up
never
this.
been on the business side of things in software development because I have like zero interest in business or money at all. But I know that there are a lot of different models out there. Probably is more like the Wild West than anything else in software development. The differences in models and things, like people make
That's
up
how I would do it.
ways of doing things all the time. Okay, so let's talk about some tools. So project management tools. So this is the tools that let you know who's working on what and when, and what is the size of this work, and when is this work planned, and so those are project management tools. In this class, we're going to look at Trello. The ones that I've used in my career are Trello and Jira. I also use some other ticketing systems like Perforce. So that's a source code repository, but also with ticketing systems, Perforce, and one called CMVC that I think was an IBM proprietary thing, possibly. They're all different kinds of tools, so don't be too fussed about learning particular tools. It's more about learning what these tools are used for and how they're used. If you go work for someone, they're going to train you up on the specific tools that they use. Okay, so don't worry too much about understanding all the tools, but we'll get familiar with Trello. In this course, of course, we're using GitHub, which is a good one to become familiar with. Learning Git means that even if a company uses Bitbucket or GitLab, you'll still knowing Git and knowing GitHub will get you there. GitLab and Bitbucket are really a lot like GitHub. There are very few differences. They both use Git underneath. So. Collaboration. So when you work on a team of software developers, you have to collaborate with them and with the testers and with the product manager, with the team leads, with the scrum master. So you have to have tools for collaboration. So we'll use Slack in this class, and we might use GitHub to some extent for that collaboration as well. And companies that I've worked for, we used Confluence for documentation. So things like design documents and testing documentation and meeting minutes and wikis on products and all that sort of thing. We used Confluence for that. Confluence is another Atlassian, I have to think about that word every time I say it, Atlassian tool. Confluence and Jira work together. So we'll use Slack, GitHub, and Trello in this class. All right, so that is all of the presentation. Let's have a look at Trello. So from your laptop, you can go to Trello.com. And I am going to, what will I do? All right, so some of the things that you can do from here is you can create a team. So when you're working on a project, for example, in this course, you should create a team with yourself and whoever you're working on the project with, and also put Varsha and myself on that team as well, so we can look at your Trello board. And so we can, if you have questions or have a question for us about your board or need some advice, so we can look at your board. So you can create a team and you can create a board. You can only create a business team if you have a paid version of Trello. But I'm going to create a board. By default, it has no team, but you can, if you have teams created already, you can assign a team to it. By default, it's private, and you can only have members that you assign as collaborators to this board look at it. You can make it public, and then anyone can see it. So you can also pick a background for it, which is nice, Everybody likes a little background. So I'm going to just make a plain blue background for the moment, but you can make a background. And then you have to give it a title. So I'm going to call this one Trello Demo. Okay, I'm going to do it with the cafe project in mind. So once you give it a title, you can click the Create Board button. And then what you have here is you can see where you can invite people to collaborate with the invite button. So you can put email addresses here, or if you know their Trello usernames, you can put their Trello usernames here. You can create a link to invite people with a link, and anybody with the link can join as a board member, so that's another way to invite people. So one of those two ways you can invite people, or you can add a team like we saw. So right now it's a personal board with no team, but if you created a team, you could add a team and those people would be members, okay? Here's where you can change it from private to public if you want to. So it's a pretty nice, easy to use user interface. You can change the background after you start. There's some other settings here and some things. You can copy a board that you have and and use that one as a starting point. You can print and export a board. Some of these things might be paid, I'm not sure. Print and export might be a paid option. But the basic way you use a Trello board is you add lists. So for example, when we're working on the Terminal App project, we might have a list called README items. And we'll talk more about this next week, but you're going to have to provide a README with every assessment you do, a README markdown file, okay? And that README will have to contain information that's specified by the assessment, all right? And so there will always be a list of things that need to be documented. So you could call it README items, or you could call it documentation, whatever you want to call it. And then add lists, and that creates a list. And then you can add cards to a list. So you can say add project overview information, for example. Could be a card that we add to the README items. Now, let's have a look at a card. So once you've added a card, you can click on it and you get this view of the card. So you can add a more detailed description. You can add comments. So this is a way that you can collaborate, right? So if you have other members, your team members can comment on cards. You can assign members to a card. So if, for example, my job is to add the project overview information, then I can add myself to it. So I can do it with this members, and I can add a member, and you'll see the members will show up here. Or I'm going to show you another way is you can actually, I'm going to invite somebody. So Vic, I'll invite you. What email is your Trello under? Here, I'll do invite with a link. That might be easier. Let me create a link. I'll paste it in Slack. And then you guys can join by clicking on that link. I'm not sure if it sends you an email or something, but anybody can. You click on the link I just put in everyone.
What's the invitation link for this board is not valid anymore?
What? I just made it.
Join the board. I can join the board.
Yeah, for me it wasn't. Is it for only one person?
It shouldn't be.
So how was I able to join
So
the board?
there's maybe there's a limit to how many people I can have. Okay. So that might be true of the free version.
Oh no.
Is it letting you know?
Yeah.
Okay.
It just didn't like me the first one.
Right. So see, I could say, okay, this Carl's going to work on this, and I can just drag his picture, his little icon over. Right? So that's a way that we can tell who's working on something or who's going to work on something. Okay, so we might have README items. Then we might have, what's typical is we'd have a list called something like backlog. And this backlog is the things that we intend to do, but that we haven't we haven't scoped or planned yet. And we just collect the things we need to do here. So there'll be things like if we're building our cafe terminal app, there would be something like define classes and with attributes for app. And then maybe we have write test plan for app, and maybe we'll have check for dryness, maybe check naming conventions, things like this. And then we'd have a list to do. So these, generally what we put in the to-do list, we've already scoped. So say, for example, define classes. We say, okay, we can, let me show you some other cool things we can do. We could, for example, add a checklist. And I like to call my checklist subtasks, but you can call it whatever you want. And then we can say define define item class, define order class, and so now we've got these two items, and we might put something here like we might say that overall we think that this is going to take 2 hours. 2 hours to define classes and attributes without defining or without implementing all of the methods. So just defining the classes and attributes and maybe just method shells. We think that'll take about 2 hours. Then we can do this cool thing. We can add labels, and we can make this up. So we can say, we're going to call any, and you decide on these things as a team. You might say anything that takes less than 1 hour is small, a small task. Anything that takes 1 to 2 hours is a medium task. So we might say medium. We'll create a new medium label, and we can give it a color, and then we'll put that label on our card. And then when I close the card, you'll see that label's on it. And then we'll say, okay, all right, I know I'm going to work on that now. Janelle's going to work on that one. And if we look at the card, 2 hours, so we expect that to move to the in progress when I start working on it. And then ready for review when I'm done with it. And then testing, and then done. So the idea here, and you don't have to name them exactly this, but you want to represent sort of these parts of the process that we talked about in the workflow. So say that, so what you'll want to do when you work on your project is you'll want to try to define as much as you can all the things that need to be done. Then sit together for an hour or so and try to estimate how long you think it'll do those things. And as you go through that estimation process, you'll realize, okay, we're not going to have time to do that. We have the whole list of things, and maybe those things stay in backlog. But then you'll decide on what are the MVP items, the minimum viable product. What is necessary for us to call this thing done? And for you, for an assessment, it should be, what do we have to do to get whatever mark you've agreed you're going to aim for, okay? If you're just aiming for passing, then your MVP is what do we have to do to get passing marks against this rubric criteria. If you're aiming for a credit, what is the minimum we need to do to get a credit for this assessment? If you're aiming for distinction or high distinction, then you'll define for yourselves what are the things we have to do at a minimum to reach that level, okay? So that takes some negotiation between you and your partner, and you will have to look at the rubric, which we'll do together on Wednesday, okay, to decide what are the tasks that go with this. Then once you decide what you actually are going to do, you slide those into the to-do column. Okay, those are the things that you both agree, this is what we're going to do. Then as you start to work on them, I say, okay, now I'm going to work on this, and you should put them in priority order. So let's say writing a test plan. We say that this, is going to take about 2 hours also. We'll give it a medium label. And we'll say write a test test plan in a spreadsheet with all testable items. And then we're also going to have to test things too. So this is just writing a test plan. And so we're going to leave that in to do, and we put that underneath define classes with attributes for app. We're also going to need a card for implement class methods, and we're going to need one for implement cafe app itself. And then you might need to break these down more, which you can do either by creating more cards or by creating subclasses. And you might say that implementing it comes next in priority order. So the idea is that, and maybe we think that this is implementing class methods will take, maybe 3 hours, or maybe it'll take more than that. Let's say 4 hours to implement all methods in each class. And so maybe we give that one a large label. So we'll create a large label, and I guess sure we'll make it blue. And that one we're going to give to abs. And so when I'm ready to work, the way that this should happen, if my Trello board's nicely organized, it's in priority order. So I just look for the thing with my face on it that's closest to the top. And then I take this thing and drag it into in progress. And if I need to make notes on it while I'm working on it, I can do that on the Trello card if I want. Or I can communicate with my partner in Slack, or I can do that communication through GitHub. And one of the things you need to decide as a team is how do we want to communicate with each other about how things are going, and if we need something reviewed. Now when I'm done with it, then I would move it to ready for review, and I might stick a teammate's picture on it and say, okay, Aiden, I need you to review this. And then when it's done being reviewed, then it would move to testing, and we make sure that it's tested and our spreadsheet is updated with the test results. And maybe, we agree that the person who did the code has to test it, maybe. So in which case I can go to members and I can remove Aiden from the card at that point. Say, okay, I'm going to be the one that's testing this, and when it's all done, it moves to the done column. So you can see by following a process like this, at any point, it's clear what are we planning to do, who's going to do it, and what's in progress, where things are, right? Now, in order for this to work for us, we have to use it. So you have to decide between yourself and your teammates, this is how we're going to use this Trello board. This is what all the lists mean. This is the process we're going to follow. And then everybody has to follow that process. If somebody doesn't follow the process, then the Trello board is no good. Okay? So one of the problems that I've seen in the past, not so much with the Terminal app because it's small, it's only 2 days, you only work on it with 2 people. But when we get to the Rails assessment and to the MERN assessment, where you have a larger team over a longer period of time, if you don't follow a disciplined process with your Trello board, things will not go well. You'll be panicking at the last minute. You'll be confused about who's working on what. 2 people will work on the same thing at the same time, and then there'll be tears when you have to decide whose code you're going to keep and whose code you're going to throw away. Okay? And there'll be frustration. Well, I thought I was working on this. No, we said I was going to work on this. Well, if you're using the Trello board properly, it's super clear who's working on what and when they're working on it and where they are in working on it. Okay? So it is really in your best interest to use the Trello board and learn how to use it. Because when you go work on a team outside of here, if you've developed some good habits and disciplines about using a well-defined method for managing your project, it's going to make you more valuable than other people. So, Is that pretty clear for people? I'll show you one more thing about Trello that's cool, is that you can add power-ups. Now, when you have the free version, you only get one power-up. And it's here under the main menu. Okay, so see, I was at more and I had to go back for more to get back to the main menu. This power-ups. Power-ups are basically plugins or extensions for Trello that are made by people. They're third-party extensions. Some of them are made by the Trello people. A bunch of them are made by other people. And there are hundreds of them, or maybe thousands. And with the free version of Trello, you can only use one. Some of the power-ups have free components and paid components. Some of them are just basic. There's Git integration. There's all kinds of cool things. There's integration with pretty much any source repository tool, or there's Jira integration, which seems weird to me, but okay. There's a whole section for IT and project management, so you can look through what some of those things are. I'll tell you my favorite one, if I only have one to use, is, what is it called? I have to think about what it's called every time. It's custom fields. I really like custom fields. So, and you'll see this when you pick one. It's basically telling you've reached your limit because you can only pick one on the free version. That's all that means. If you decide you want to try a different one, you just come back to this power-ups page, find the one that you've picked, and disable it, and you can pick a different one. Okay? But I'm going to show you custom fields. So the way custom fields works is I can create a custom field, and I can make it any type that I want. And so it's just like labels, but with more flexibility. So I could, for example, say, instead of using a label for scoping, I could create a drop-down called like estimate, and then I can add options like small, medium, large, and then you can set colors for these things. Okay, and then this checkbox, show field on front of card, means it'll show when you just look at your board, which is nice. And then you can create that. And so then instead of using my labels, I can get rid of that label. So you get rid of a label, it's a toggle check mark to add a label or remove it. I can get rid of that label and use my custom field. Oh, this one was large, wasn't it? And then it shows like that. I like that. And you can add as many custom fields as you want to the card. So you can have fields for due date, or for complexity, or whatever you want. So I kind of like that feature. So I would change this one. I would get rid of my label and use my custom fields instead. But you can have a look at the power-ups and see which one you want to play with, which ones you like. Yeah, John.
So with the power-ups, can the person who created that board only activate the power-ups within that board, or can everybody choose one power-up?
No, so you can only have one power-up per board on the free version. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because I was going to say then we would sort of choose.
Yeah, that would be nice.
It would be a pretty
Yeah.
easy way to get around it if they didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's just one power-up per board. Yeah. All right. So for your terminal app assessment, you need to use Trello. Okay? Don't be too concerned with how well you use it, but you need to practice using it for planning your project and for working on your project. It's a little bit trivial for this first project because it's a 2-day project and you're probably going to be sitting next to each other when you work on it. But you may decide you want to work, outside of the classroom on it, particularly if you're a person, who has to leave early for transportation or other reasons. You might decide with your partner, okay, I'm going to work on it for a couple of hours tonight, and in that case it makes sense to use the Trello board to track where you are and what's going on, okay? But even if it's trivial in this case, practice using it just for the practice of it, all right? And then when we get to the Rails assessment, it'll be a lot more useful. But even if you work on a project yourself, it can be useful to keep yourself on track and keep up with what your goals are and whether or not you're on schedule. It's just a way to keep yourself accountable, right? And it's I think it's a really nice tool to use. It's super easy. There's a nice app for your phone. The phone app is actually really nice and usable, I find. It's real easy to navigate around it. So I've got Trello on my phone and I use Trello here. So I'll just show you the one we're using for a real project we're working on, this one. So it's full of stuff. So we have a list for definitions, which defines our labels. So we're using t-shirt sizes to estimate the time for things, where we have small, medium, large, and extra large. And if we click on that, we have a description of what those things mean. So it makes sense that this is in our definitions list. So anybody who's using this board, if we have another team member come on board or we forget the way we define things, we can look back at this. The importance scale that we have and what it means. The Git workflow that we're using, so it's defined here. And we have a link to the GitHub repo. And any discussion we had about that. If a task on a card will take longer than 4 hours to implement, convert it to a new card. So that's just defining what we define a task as, the boundaries of a task. So then we have a documentation list. We have a backlog ideas list, which are things that we want to remember that we thought about doing, but we probably won't do on the MVP. Then we have our to-do list, which is all the things we plan to do on the MVP. Then we have our sprint, which you can see that we haven't worked on it. So there you go. We all got too busy with work to work on it, but this is the things we'll have to work on next. Things that are in progress, things that need review, things that are done. So, and you can see here the people that are working on this. So we also write things in terms of user stories, which we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about that a little bit this afternoon, because user stories are a really nice way to define the work that you need to do. All right, so any questions? I think what we'll do is we'll take a break for lunch, and then this afternoon